Hello, welcome to Expertly Weird. Have you ever complained about having to wake up early for work or dealing with slow internet? Well, after watching this video, you might never complain about modern life again. Because while you think you have it tough right now, there have been moments in human history where simply being born was essentially a death sentence wrapped in unimaginable suffering. Today we're diving deep into the absolute worst periods to enter this world. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll be thanking whatever forces exist that you weren't born during these nightmare scenarios. We're talking about eras so brutal, so devastating, that survival itself was considered a miracle. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. I've spent weeks researching the most horrific periods in human existence, and what I discovered will completely change how you view your daily struggles. Because not only am I going to reveal these terrible times, but I'm also going to show you exactly why each period was uniquely awful and how the people living through them somehow managed to survive. By the time we're finished, you'll understand why historians consider these particular moments to be humanity's darkest hours, and you'll have a completely new appreciation for the luxuries you take for granted every single day. Let's start our journey in one of the most overlooked yet absolutely devastating periods in human history. Most people know the Roman Empire eventually collapsed, but what they don't realize is that the aftermath was far worse than the fall itself. We're talking about the period historians call Late Antiquity, roughly spanning from 450 to 700 AD. Picture this: you're living in what was once the mighty Roman Empire, but now everything you've ever known is crumbling around you. The government that controlled your entire world for centuries has vanished overnight. The armies that protected your cities are gone. The roads that connected your community to the rest of civilization are falling apart. Even the money you used to buy food has become worthless pieces of metal. This wasn't just a simple change of leadership. This was complete total collapse happening in soci real time. And if this chaos you were born during, your chances of living to see adulthood were incredibly slim. Why? Because when massive empires fall, they leave behind something called a power vacuum, and everyone wants to fill it. Imagine waking up every morning not knowing if today would be the day barbarian tribes decided to raid your village. The Goths, Vandals and Huns weren't just occasional threats anymore. They were constant dangers circling like vultures, knowing that the once mighty Roman military machine was now scattered and weak. For soldiers during this time, combat became a death sentence. They lacked proper equipment, training and support that their predecessors had enjoyed. They were essentially being sent into battles they couldn't win with weapons they couldn't rely on. For civilians, protection was virtually non-existent. Your family could be sleeping peacefully one night and wake up to the sound of raiders breaking down your door. But the warfare was just the beginning of your problems. The economic system that had sustained millions of people for generations completely collapsed. Trade networks that had connected distant lands suddenly disappeared. Cities that had thrived for centuries were abandoned as people fled to find safety elsewhere. Agricultural systems that fed entire populations were destroyed by constant invasions. Think about how devastating this would be on a personal level. Imagine if every store in your city closed tomorrow, every bank shut down, and every job disappeared simultaneously. Now multiply that chaos by 1,000 and stretch it across several centuries. That's what people during late antiquity experienced every single day. The most heartbreaking part was watching their cultural heritage literally crumble before their eyes. Those magnificent Roman buildings, temples and monuments that had stood for hundreds of years were either being destroyed in raids or torn apart piece by piece to build new structures. People were essentially watching their entire civilization get recycled into something completely different. But wait, it gets worse. Because during this same period, a massive religious transformation was taking place. Christianity was rising. Which sounds positive until you realise this created enormous conflict with existing belief systems. Religious wars, persecution, and forced conversions added another layer of terror to daily life. you might be thinking that at least people could find comfort in their faith during these difficult times. But imagine being told that everything your ancestors believed was wrong, and if you didn't convert to this new religion, you could face violence or exile. This spiritual upheaval made an already chaotic situation even more unbearable. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse during late antiquity, nature itself decided to join the assault on humanity. Enter the Justinianic plague, which swept across the Mediterranean from 550 to 750 AD. This wasn't just any disease. This was one of the most deadly pandemics in human history, killing tens of millions of people over 2 centuries. Picture trying to survive political chaos, economic collapse, constant warfare, and religious persecution, only to have a deadly plague start wiping out everyone around you. Entire families would disappear within weeks. Villages would become ghost towns overnight. The few functioning governments left were powerless to stop the spread of disease. This plague didn't discriminate. Rich or poor, young or old, Christian or pagan, everyone was vulnerable. And remember, this was happening during a time when medical knowledge was extremely limited. People had no understanding of germs, bacteria, or how diseases spread. They were fighting an invisible enemy with prayer and superstition as their only weapons. The psychological impact of living through this period must have been absolutely crushing. Imagine watching your entire world transform into something unrecognizable while simultaneously wondering if you or your loved ones would be the next victims of war, starvation, or disease. Every day would feel like borrowed time, yet somehow people survived. They adapted, they rebuilt, and they eventually created the foundation for what would become medieval Europe. But the cost was enormous, and the suffering was unimaginable. This period represents everything that can go wrong with human civilization simultaneously: political collapse, economic devastation, social upheaval, religious conflict, constant warfare, and deadly pandemics, all happening at once over several centuries. If you were born during late antiquity, you were essentially entering a world where survival itself was an achievement. But as terrible as late antiquity was, it's just the beginning of our journey through history's worst moments. Because humanity has faced even darker periods, times when the very concept of hope seemed to disappear from the world entirely. Our next stop takes us forward in time to what might be the most concentrated period of human suffering ever recorded. We're talking about the early 20th century, specifically the devastating stretch from 1914 to 1945. If you think dealing with one major crisis is challenging, imagine facing multiple apocalyptic events back to back for over 30 years straight. Let's paint this picture clearly. You're born in 1900, and by the time you're 14 years old, the entire world erupts into the most destructive conflict humanity had ever seen. World War I wasn't just a war between armies, it was a meat grinder that consumed an entire generation of young men and reshaped how humans could inflict suffering on each other. The technology of death had advanced faster than anyone's ability to defend against it. Machine guns could mow down hundreds of soldiers in minutes. Poison gas turned battlefields into toxic wastelands, where men died choking on their own blood. Artillery shells could obliterate entire sections of trenches, burying soldiers alive under tons of mud and debris. But here's what made this period uniquely horrible. If you were a healthy young man during this time, society didn't just expect you to fight, they demanded it. Refusing to join the military meant facing social ostracism, imprisonment, or worse. Millions of 18 and 19-year-olds were essentially forced into conditions that guaranteed their deaths. The numbers alone tell a story of unprecedented age. Between 15 and 22 million people died during World War I. Think about that for a moment. That's more people than currently live in most entire countries, all dead within 4 years. And these weren't quick, merciful deaths. Soldiers spent months living in flooded trenches, surrounded by rats, disease, and the rotting corpses of their friends. Civilians weren't safe either. Modern warfare had evolved to target entire populations, not just military forces. Cities were bombed, food supplies were cut off, and entire regions became battlegrounds where innocent families were caught in the crossfire. Just when you thought humanity had learned its lesson about the horrors of industrialized warfare, something even worse arrived. In 1918, while the world was still reeling from the devastation of World War I, a pandemic struck that made the battlefield casualties look small by comparison. The Spanish flu wasn't like diseases people were familiar with. This virus was particularly deadly to healthy young adults, the exact demographic that had somehow managed to survive the trenches of Europe. It could kill someone in less than 24 hours, turning their skin blue as they essentially drowned in their own bodily fluids. The timing couldn't have been worse. Soldiers returning from war brought this disease back to their home communities. Victory celebrations became super spreader events. Hospitals that were already overwhelmed with wounded veterans now faced waves of civilians dying from an invisible enemy they couldn't fight. At least 50 million people died from the Spanish flu pandemic, possibly as many as 100 million. To put this in perspective, this single disease killed more people in 2 years than World War I killed in 4 years. Entire families were wiped out. Orphanages overflowed with children whose parents had died within days of each other. But surely after surviving a world war and a deadly pandemic, people deserved some peace and recovery time, right? Wrong, because just as communities were starting to rebuild their lives, the bottom fell out of the global economy. The year 1929 marked the beginning of the Great Depression, and if you thought war and disease were bad, economic collapse brought its own unique form of suffering. At least during wartime, there was a sense of purpose, a clear enemy to fight against. During the Depression, the enemy was invisible and seemingly unstoppable. Unemployment rates soared to 25% in some areas. That means 1 out of every 4 people who wanted to work couldn't find jobs. But these weren't just statistics. These were families watching their life savings disappear overnight when banks failed. These were successful business owners who went from prosperity to poverty in a matter of days. The psychological impact was devastating in ways that physical violence couldn't match. Imagine spending your entire adult life building a career, saving money, and creating stability for your family, only to watch it all vanish through no fault of your own. Men who had been providers for their families suddenly found themselves standing in breadlines, unable to feed their children. Suicide rates skyrocketed as people lost hope. Families were torn apart as parents abandoned their children because they couldn't afford to feed them. Entire communities became ghost towns as people migrated desperately, searching for work that didn't exist. The most vulnerable members of society suffered the worst. Elderly people who had worked their entire lives found themselves destitute and homeless. Children grew up malnourished, their growth permanently stunted by years of inadequate nutrition. Disabled individuals lost what little support systems existed as government resources dried up completely. But here's where this period becomes truly nightmarish. Just as people were starting to recover from the Great Depression, the world plunged into an even more devastating conflict than World War I. World War II lasted longer, killed more people, and introduced levels of systematic cruelty that still haunt humanity today. The death toll was staggering. Between 70 and 85 million people died during World War II. Nearly half of these were civilians, including women, children, and elderly people who had nothing to do with the fighting. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Millions of people were systematically murdered in ways that defy comprehension. The technology of destruction had advanced even further. Bombers could now level entire cities in single raids. New weapons could kill thousands of people instantly. The war ended with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, introducing humanity to weapons capable of destroying all life on Earth. If you were born in 1898, by the time World War II ended, you would have lived through 4 major global catastrophes before reaching middle age. You would have seen more death, destruction, and suffering than most people could imagine in their worst nightmares, and you would still have decades of life ahead of you, carrying the psychological scars of everything you had witnessed. This 30-year period represents humanity at its absolute worst. It shows how quickly civilization can collapse, how technology can be turned toward destruction, and how ordinary people can be caught in circumstances completely beyond their control. Yet people survived. They rebuilt. They created international institutions designed to prevent such disasters from happening again. But the cost was enormous, and the trauma lasted for generations. The early 20th century proves that being born during the wrong historical moment can mean experiencing multiple apocalypses in a single lifetime. It's a reminder that the peace and prosperity many of us take for granted today is neither guaranteed nor permanent. But as devastating as the early 20th century was, there's one single year that historians have identified as potentially the worst year to be alive in all of human history. We're talking about 536 AD, and what happened during those 12 months reads like something out of a horror novel. Imagine waking up one morning and noticing the sun looks different, not just cloudy or overcast, but actually dimmed, as if someone had placed a filter over the entire sky. Then imagine that this darkness doesn't go away, not for days, not for weeks, but for an entire year and a half. This is exactly what people across Europe and Asia experienced starting in 536 AD. A massive volcanic eruption in Iceland had thrown so much ash and debris into the atmosphere that it literally blocked out sunlight across huge portions of the globe. Temperatures plummeted by several degrees, creating what scientists now call a volcanic winter. But here's what makes this particularly terrifying. The people living through this had no idea what was happening. They had no understanding of volcanoes, atmospheric science, or climate systems. From their perspective, the world was simply ending. The sun, which had reliably provided light and warmth for their entire lives, had suddenly been extinguished by some unknown force. The psychological impact alone must have been crushing. Religious communities interpreted this as divine punishment or the beginning of the apocalypse. Parents watched their children ask why the sky looked wrong, and they had no answers to give. Farmers stared at their fields, knowing that crops couldn't grow without proper sunlight, but powerless to do anything about it. The agricultural consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Crops failed across entire continents, livestock died from cold and starvation. Food stores that communities relied on during difficult times were quickly exhausted, as people realized this wasn't a temporary setback, but a fundamental change in their environment. Famine spread like wildfire. People who had never experienced real hunger suddenly found themselves competing for scraps of food. Communities that had coexisted peacefully for generations turned against each other as resources became scarce. Parents faced the impossible choice of watching their children starve or taking food from other families. But the darkness and famine were just the beginning of this nightmare year. The climate disruption caused by the volcanic winter created perfect conditions for disease to spread. Weakened immune systems, poor nutrition, and crowded living conditions, as people huddled together for warmth, created a recipe for pandemic disaster. In China, it literally snowed during summer months. Imagine trying to explain that to someone who had lived their entire life, understanding that seasons follow predictable patterns. The fundamental rules of nature seem to have been suspended, creating a sense that reality itself was breaking down. The economic systems of the time, which were already fragile, completely collapsed under this environmental pressure. Trade routes that connected distant communities became impassable due to unusual weather patterns. Markets that had operated for centuries simply shut down as people focused entirely on basic survival. What made 536 AD uniquely horrible was that it combined natural disaster with human suffering in ways that amplified both. The volcanic winter didn't just cause environmental problems, it triggered political instability, social unrest, and cultural breakdown that lasted long after the skies cleared. Leaders who had maintained power through their ability to provide stability and prosperity suddenly found themselves helpless against forces they couldn't understand or control. Governments that had functioned for generations crumbled as people lost faith in institutions that couldn't protect them from this cosmic-scale disaster. The most heartbreaking aspect was how this affected children. Imagine being a young person during this time, watching adults around you panic and lose hope while you're still trying to understand basic concepts about how the world works. Many children who lived through 536 AD carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives, and those who survived to have children of their own passed down stories of the year the sun disappeared. Religious institutions, which typically provided comfort during difficult times, found themselves struggling to explain events that seemed to contradict everything they taught about divine providence and natural order. Some communities turned to extreme religious practices, believing they needed to appease angry gods. Others lost faith entirely, creating spiritual crises that lasted for generations. The volcanic winter of 536 AD eventually ended, but its effects continued for over a century. Climate patterns remained unstable, creating what historians call the Late Antique Little Ice Age. This meant that people didn't just endure one terrible year, they faced decades of unpredictable weather, failed harvests, and environmental instability. Recovery from this disaster was incredibly slow because it had damaged so many interconnected systems simultaneously. Agriculture, trade, government, and social structures all needed to be rebuilt from scratch in many areas. Communities that had thrived for centuries simply disappeared, their populations scattered or dead. What makes 536 AD stand out among history's worst years is how it demonstrates humanity's complete vulnerability to forces beyond our control. Wars can be fought, diseases can sometimes be treated, and economic problems can theoretically be solved through human action. But when nature itself turns hostile on a global scale, there's nothing people can do except endure and hope to survive. Yet somehow, people did survive. They adapted to the new climate conditions, developed techniques, and slowly new agricultural rebuilt their communities. But the cost was enormous, and the trauma of that year echoed through generations of survivors who never forgot the time when the sun went dark. Moving forward through history's timeline of suffering, we encounter another period that was uniquely devastating for a specific group of people. The late 1400s marked the beginning of what would become one of history's most complete cultural destructions, the European colonization of the Americas. If you American after were born as a native 1492, you were entering a world where your entire way of life was under assault from forces you couldn't possibly understand or defend against. This wasn't just conquest in the traditional sense. This was biological warfare on a scale that had never been seen before, carried out by people who didn't even realize they were doing it. The European explorers and settlers who arrived in the Americas brought with them diseases that had evolved alongside human populations for thousands of years. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and other illnesses had killed millions of Europeans throughout history, but survivors had developed some level of immunity. Native American populations had no such protection. The death toll was almost incomprehensible. Conservative estimates suggest that 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died from disease within the first century after European contact. In some regions, the mortality rate reached 95%. Entire civilizations that had existed for thousands of years were wiped out within a single generation. Imagine being a child during this period, watching everyone you know die from mysterious illnesses that seem to target your people specifically while leaving the newcomers largely unaffected. Parents buried their children, then died themselves. Grandparents, who carried centuries of cultural knowledge and wisdom, passed away before they could transfer their understanding to younger generations. The speed of this collapse was terrifying. Communities that had been thriving and stable for generations could be reduced to ghost towns within months of first contact with Europeans. The social structures, political systems, and cultural traditions that had sustained these populations simply couldn't survive when the vast majority of their people were dead. But the diseases were just the beginning of the nightmare. As Native American populations weakened and died, European settlers realized they had an enormous advantage they could exploit. What followed displacement was systematic violence and cultural destruction that continued for centuries. Native Americans found themselves facing an enemy with superior military technology, including guns, steel weapons, and horses. But more importantly, they were facing people who viewed them as obstacles to be removed, rather than fellow human beings with legitimate claims to their ancestral lands. Families who had lived in the same areas for countless generations were forced to abandon everything they knew and relocate to unfamiliar territories. Sacred sites were destroyed or desecrated. Traditional hunting grounds were claimed by settlers who had no understanding of or respect for indigenous land management practices. The psychological trauma of this period is difficult to imagine. Native Americans weren't just losing their lives and their land. They were watching their entire worldview become irrelevant overnight. Languages that had been spoken for thousands of years began disappearing as communities were scattered and children were separated from their families. Children born during this period grew up in a world where everything their ancestors had believed about life, spirituality, and human relationships was being systematically destroyed. They watched their elders die, not just from disease, but from despair as they realized their way of life was ending forever. The European colonists, meanwhile, often justified their actions by claiming they were bringing civilization and Christianity to savage peoples. This religious and cultural arrogance added another layer of cruelty to an already devastating situation. Native Americans weren't just being killed and displaced. They were being told that everything they believed was wrong and evil. Forced conversion to Christianity meant abandoning spiritual practices that had sustained these communities for millennia. Children were taken from their families and placed in schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. Traditional names, languages, and customs were forbidden under penalty of punishment or death. The long-term effects of this period continue to impact Native American communities today. The trauma of colonization was passed down through generations, creating social problems that persist centuries later. Entire cultures, languages, and knowledge representing systems were lost forever, an incalculable loss to human civilization as a whole. What makes this period particularly tragic is that it was entirely preventable. The death and destruction that followed European colonization wasn't the result of natural disasters or unavoidable conflicts of human. It was the consequence choices, cultural blindness, and a complete failure to recognize the humanity and value of indigenous peoples. Yet despite facing what can only be described as an attempt at cultural genocide, many Native American communities survived. They preserved what they could of their traditions, adapted to new circumstances, and maintained their identity despite centuries of oppression. Their resilience in the face of such overwhelming destruction is a testament to the strength of human spirit and cultural bonds. The colonization of the Americas represents one of history's most complete examples of what happens when technological and biological advantages are combined with cultural arrogance and greed. For Native Americans born during this period, survival itself was an act of resistance against forces determined to erase their existence from history. But our journey through history's worst periods isn't complete yet. We need to travel back much further in time, to an era so alien and hostile that it challenges our understanding of what it means to be alive on Earth. We're talking about a period when the very air people breathed could kill them, and the creatures sharing their world were the stuff of nightmares. Welcome to the Carboniferous period, spanning from roughly 359 to 299 million years ago. Now I know what you're thinking. Humans didn't exist back then, so how can this be relevant to our discussion? Well, imagine if you could somehow be transported back to this prehistoric nightmare and had to survive as a human being. Trust me, you'd be begging to return to any of the previous periods we've discussed. The first thing that would hit you about the Carboniferous period is the air itself. You might think breathing air with more oxygen sounds fantastic, right? Well, during this time, atmospheric oxygen levels reach 35%, compared to the 21% we breathe today. That extra oxygen might give you a temporary energy boost, but it would also slowly poison your system through oxygen toxicity. But that's not even the scary part about all this extra oxygen. Here's what makes this period absolutely terrifying. Oxygen is incredibly flammable. Those lush, dense forests that covered most of the planet during this time were basically giant tinderboxes waiting to explode. When lightning struck or volcanic activity created sparks, massive wildfires would erupt and burn completely out of control for months or even years at a time. Picture trying to build a civilization when forest fires the size of entire continents could rage for decades without stopping. There would be no safe place to establish permanent settlements, no way to develop agriculture, and no protection from the constant threat of being burned alive by fires that moved faster than you could run. The oxygen-rich atmosphere created another problem that would make your life absolutely miserable. It allowed insects and arthropods to grow to absolutely monstrous sizes. We're not talking about slightly bigger bugs here. We're talking about creatures that would make your worst nightmares seem pleasant by comparison. Dragonflies with wingspans over 2 feet long would be buzzing through the air like flying predators. These weren't the delicate dragonflies you see near ponds today. These were massive hunting machines capable of taking down prey much larger than themselves. Imagine trying to walk through a forest while being stalked by dragonflies the size of hawks. But the giant dragonflies would be the least of your worries. Millipedes over 8 feet long would be crawling across the landscape like armoured trains. These creatures were essentially living tanks, covered in protective segments and capable of coiling up into defensive balls larger than most humans. The thought of encountering one of these monsters in the dark would be enough to drive anyone insane with terror. And we haven't even discussed the spiders yet. During the Carboniferous period, arachnids grew to sizes that would make modern tarantulas look like tiny house pets. We're talking about spiders with leg spans that could cover a dinner table, equipped with fangs capable of injecting enough venom to kill large animals. The entire ecosystem was designed around these gigantic arthropods. They were the dominant predators, the primary decomposers, and the most successful life forms on the planet. As a human trying to survive in this environment, you would essentially be a tiny, vulnerable creature surrounded by monsters that could kill you in dozens of different ways. But wait, there's more nightmare fuel to consider. The Carboniferous period was also known as the Golden Age of Sharks. The oceans were filled with massive predatory fish that made modern great whites look like minnows. Some of these ancient sharks reached lengths of over 40 feet and had jaws powerful enough to crush small boats. This meant that both land and sea were essentially off limits for human survival. The forests were filled with giant insects and constant wildfires. The oceans were dominated by prehistoric super predators. Even the swamps and rivers were dangerous, as they served as breeding grounds for enormous amphibians that could swallow a person whole. The climatid have been incredibly itself challenging for human survival. The high oxygen content created a greenhouse effect that made temperatures much hotter and more humid than anything we experience today. The atmospheric pressure was different, which would affect everything from your breathing to your cardiovascular system. Plant life, while abundant, was completely alien to anything humans could use for nutrition or shelter. The massive fern forests that covered the planet were beautiful to look at, but they provided no edible fruits, nuts, or grains that could sustain human populations. You would be constantly on the verge of starvation while being hunted by creatures from your worst nightmares. The geological activity during this period was also incredibly violent. Massive volcanic eruptions were common, creating toxic gas clouds that could kill everything in their path. Earthquakes regularly reshaped the landscape, making it impossible to establish any kind of permanent shelter or safe refuge. Perhaps most terrifying of all, there would be no other humans around to help you survive. No communities to join, no accumulated knowledge to draw upon, no tools or weapons developed over generations of human experience. You would be completely alone in a world designed to kill you in the most horrific ways imaginable. Looking back at these periods of unimaginable suffering, from late antiquity's collapse to the volcanic winter of 536 AD, from the devastating early 20th century to the nightmare of colonization, we've witnessed humanity's darkest chapters. Each era tested human endurance beyond what seems possible, yet people found ways to survive, adapt, and rebuild. So the next time you're frustrated with your daily struggles, remember that you're living in one of the most peaceful, prosperous, and safe periods in all of human history. Your biggest problems would seem like luxuries to someone born in these nightmare scenarios. That perspective alone should make you grateful for every ordinary day you get to experience.